Welcome to another edition of Hunter in the Round. Tonight's program will focus on the increasing diversity in America's public schools and its implication for educators. Two leaders in discussion are Professor Virginia Tung, who is a faculty member in the TESOL graduate program here at Hunter. Her interest area are social linguistics and how acculturation adaptation to the United States affects the learning of English. Also with us is Professor Tom McIntyre, who is a member of the Special Education Department here at Hunter. He is the past president of the National Teachers Educators of Children with Behavior Disorders and the New York Council for the Children with Behavior Disorders. Welcome to the program. Virginia, let's begin with you. Could you please tell us what acculturation means and why is it such an important issue these days?
Well, let me address the last point first. I think it's really important because of the continued influx of immigrants from many, many countries, and we as educators need to refocus our ideas past so that we can create new models for teaching our students effectively. Acculturation is a really complex process, and often we've thought about acculturation in terms of language. Well, it's more than that. It's really more social, psychological, and cultural, and I think equally all four components really need to contribute to the social adaptation or the integration of these immigrants to our new society, where they're reconciling their old culture with the new culture and really deciding, and I think that's the key point, that they're really deciding if they want to accept the new culture. And I think it causes conflict, and that's something that we really need to address as educators.
What is the relationship between acculturation and, let's say, learning English?
Well, acculturation is by definition, if, as it were, the process of becoming integrated. Whether the decision to integrate has been decided is not an issue. Acculturation really implies the social closeness or distance. So the closer an individual is to the culture, the better they will learn the English language. So there's a direct relationship between the two. Acculturation also, as has been written, is done as a process and in several stages where you really go from the extreme, which is perseverance, to assimilation. And along this continuum, concurrently exists this continuum of language, so that if teachers were to understand that students go through a process where it's an acculturation continuum and a second language continuum, they can focus on some of the learning problems of our students. So there's a relationship.
Do you find that there's a difference between the acculturation of, let's say, Chinese immigrants that you surveyed and other ethnic or cultural groups?
Well, the research that I conducted 2 years ago really spoke exactly to that issue, which looked at the importance of the individuals, and in this case the Chinese students, first culture and language as a station of security, so that it enabled them to go beyond the immediate present day to the future and possibly looking for the future. So the difference, and to answer your question directly, the difference is really that the Chinese students in particular really cling on to the Chinese culture and the language as a starting point to make new connections, explore new areas, make friends, so that the phenomena of existing between two languages and two cultures is really very, very clear in the research that I've looked at, where students really have created what I call a new cross-group identity, which that is not that has not been talked about before, but in this case, what's interesting is that there's more of a commitment by these students to actually reach out and explore and become a part of the mainstream society by getting credit cards, driver's licenses, and such like that, where they clearly make a political statement as well. So the acculturation process itself is not, you cannot look at it just as one process. It's so multidimensional.
Several years ago, I had an orientation class in which I had approximately 30 students. About 6 of them were of Chinese background. And what I did was that I gave the Mooney problem checklist to all the students in the class to see what kind of problems they had as freshmen. it was interesting because on the average, the students that responded to the questionnaire had about 35, 40 problems that they identified, with the exception of the Chinese students. They identified mostly 2 or 3 and very rather innocuous problems. Is that part of it, that hesitancy to give out information? Is that part of the cultural background or context?
Yes and no. There's a very strong ethnic pride. And the language, of course, it being so different from English, in this case, really serves as a cloak to keep their inner feelings pretty private. This is not to say that the new generations of immigrants that come don't experience a different socialization process, because the immigrants that you are talking about, Jorge, and I don't really know the sample all that well, but it seems that they may have come here a few years ago, 1 or 2 years ago, and that makes a big difference. It really does. What I found clearly in my research is that our students, these were high school students who I looked at, developed very strong social networks, and they remained in the Chinatown area. They were only here for a year or 2, and this is only a few years ago, but still they maintained their ethnic ties. I call it a mediating Chinatown factor that prevented their reaching out to the larger society. There is a difference in terms of the tie that the privacy, yes, the privacy notion is still very prevalent, I would say, yes. Yeah.
Tom, you've written about how culturally different youngsters and students with limited English ability are at greater risk for being misidentified as needing special education. Why would limited English ability result in being diagnosed as having a behavior disorder or a learning disability?
Yeah, this phenomenon has come to be studied in the last couple of years. We're concerned that we have an overrepresentation of kids with limited English proficiency in classrooms for kids with behavior problems and learning disabilities. And we think a lot of that is misidentification, that these youngsters have difficulty communicating with the teacher, whether it's not understanding the lesson that's presented by the teacher. Even if the kid has some conversational fluency in English that's quite good, we have academic English in school, which is a different version of it. Maybe not understanding the directions on a sheet of paper or on the written assignment. And so the youngster is not able to display the knowledge he has, is not able to pick up the information that's being presented. And a teacher may refer this youngster for special education evaluation for having a learning disability or mental retardation. We can also imagine, too, that a kid not being able to communicate with others, there's got to be a great deal of frustration and stress and anxiety and pressure building up. And kids may appear to overreact to an incident. Why? Because all that frustration's built up and that sets it off. And then we refer this kid for having a behavior disorder. Or perhaps the kid with limited English proficiency doesn't understand the teacher's direction, carries out that direction incorrectly, and the teacher thinks either he's not very bright or he's defying me or he's being rebellious. So we're finding that we are getting a lot of LEP, or limited English proficient kids, being referred for special ed, and we think that that may not be the place that can serve them best.
But you also write that even if a student speaks English well, his ability of his level of acculturation might cause him to be at risk for being labeled incorrectly as having a behavior problem. How does that occur? Right.
A kid can speak English fluently, yet he comes into the school where the rules and regulations reflect the behavioral code of the European American middle class folks, which I happen to hold to and think is a wonderful system. However, other kids come from cultures where they've been raised with a different set of right and wrongs. Different cultures have different blueprints for creating a model citizen. So this youngster may have been taught other appropriate ways to react in that particular situation, other social skills. Yet when he comes to the schoolhouse door, she comes to the schoolhouse door, we say, whoa, don't be bringing that traditional African-American, Hispanic-American, Native American, Asian-American, I'm forgetting some other group in there, I'm sure. But when you come into the school, you act the right way. With 92% of teachers, and it'll be 95% by the year 2000, being from the white middle class, we tend to promote our ways, the ways that have worked for us. And a lot of kids need time to become cultural chameleons, being able to display different behaviors in different situations, but also the school needs to learn to adapt and accept kids who are doing the right thing as they've been taught.
We often hear of recent immigrant pupils doing exceptionally well in school. For example, the youngsters who came here speaking no English 5 years ago and become valedictorians of their class. Why is it that recent immigrant groups sometimes achieve better in our schools than groups that have been in the United States for many generations?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have the answer, but I can report on some of the things I've read. On the micro level, let's take the Asian culture, the recent Asian immigrants who have been rather successful in our school system. And if we look at the traditional traits of that group, it's a great deal of emphasis is placed on achievement and academics, and all groups promote that, but this group especially so. Also, there's the belief in the traditional Asian culture that effort can overcome anything. So if you're not getting an A, you put in more effort. Also, there's the unwavering respect for authority, and if you come in with those traits and characteristics, you'll do fairly well in our system, do very well as a matter of fact. But on the macro level, there's a popular conceptual view right now promoted by a gentleman named John Ogbu, who says that we have voluntary minorities and involuntary minorities, and they view the school system differently. That voluntary minorities, people who are immigrating here recently, they face housing and hiring discrimination and other sorts of discrimination, but they say, well, I guess that's part of paying our dues until we learn the system, until we get an education, until we learn the language, and then we'll be able to overcome that. But he says there are other groups that have been here on the long term, and they still face the housing and hiring discrimination, and even though there may be less discrimination, things haven't progressed as quickly as they would like. And oftentimes, if a youngster is successful in school, which has that European-American value system and behavioral code, the youngster is seen as identifying with the people who have oppressed his group, that you're not acting in our traditional ways if you're succeeding in that European-American environment. So a lot of kids are in this damned if you do and damned if you don't situation where I want to achieve, but if I do, I may be ostracized by my group for acting white. And so there's a great deal of pressure on kids who've been here, their families have been here for generations.
I did some consultant work for the Board of Education, testing students in special education. And I found that there were some students who really, really did not belong there. And yet, for whatever reason, that their parents or however it worked out, it was almost impossible to get these students out of special education. Do you find that that happens common? Is that a common occurrence?
We do find a phenomenon in special ed where once a kid is out, there isn't much, once a kid is in the special ed system, it's difficult to get back in the regular ed classroom. And that can mean one of two things at least. One is that we've identified the kids correctly and darn it, they need special ed. The other one is, unfortunately, when we use our different techniques there and a different curriculum there, they fall behind in comparison with the general ed curriculum, and then it's difficult to get them back up to speed and back in the regular classroom. And a lot of kids who are doing, on a third note, a lot of kids who are doing, again, the right thing in their group are seen as doing the wrong thing when they end up in school, and they end up in classes for the behavior disorder because we don't understand whether it's behavior or it could be a learning style. We find that certain groups tend to have a more active learning style. If you like what's going on in the classroom, there's audience reaction, there's participation, there's a little bit of joking, there's a lot of movement. But teachers who don't have that learning style, European Americans, for example, we see that as misbehavior. The kids are getting out of control when we ought to be saying, good, I've got their interest, and I think I'll do some group activity here or some performance or some role playing instead of disciplining them because they're out of control when they're saying, I'm interested, I like the lesson, but they're showing their interest in their way, which isn't understood.
What do you think can be done to avoid this misidentification?
I think on two levels we have to address it. The first is the ethnocentricity of educators. Ethnocentricity we all have in general because we all truly really only understand people like ourselves, people who've been raised the same, have gone through similar experiences, and we oftentimes look outside of our group. We say, why do those folks do that? Why don't they act the right way, my way, no matter what group you're from? Because we don't understand that there are other rights and wrongs and appropriate things to do. So we need in-service training for our teachers and pre-service training the new teachers to understand cultural differences. Because once you start reading and asking questions and finding out about other groups, those behaviors are no longer irritating. They're fascinating. You say, oh, that's a good example of what I read is oftentimes found in a group. We don't want to stereotype, but we can say certain behaviors are seen more so in some groups than other groups. Even though we see it in all groups, we see it more so in some groups. And those differences become fascinating. And then we're able to say, gee, I could modify my lessons to hook into this kid's style, or I can approach this behavior in a different way. So we need to overcome our ethnocentricity, and we also need to look at our evaluation process, that a kid from a culturally different group or speaking limited English is tested for special ed with an English-speaking test by people who don't understand that cultural group, and we can mislabel a kid as having a behavior disorder, learning disability, or mild mental retardation when the group this kid comes from says, wait, he's one of our own, and he's doing things right, and he's one of our bright ones. So we need better evaluation procedures, too. And I've been working on that, developing an instrument, and recently been published to help differentiate cultural differences from true behavior and learning problems.
Okay. Virginia, how can teachers help students become more proficient in English?
Well, Jorge, God, I wish I had the magic solution here. I think we really need to assist the way we teach our students. Essentially, there are several things that I can throw out for discussion. We need to practice good teaching, which is really to create a relaxed learning environment so that our students feel that their first culture and first language are both accepted. That's for one thing. We need to also create opportunities for students to communicate with one another in the classroom setting. Tom talked about learning styles. We need also, as educators, to understand that certain groups come from different learning styles and need to teach them how to work in groups or work in pairs. So we need to create a communicative language environment. We also need to make use of visual materials, such as videotapes of programs, so that students can see scenarios played out, so that they can begin to feel comfortable listening to and using the language itself. I think most important is that we need to have students take responsibility for their learning. That is, to think about the way that they are learning English, to make decisions about the way they're being taught even. It's a process. It's like the acculturation process. Learning language is a process also. Learning language is really unraveling some of the cultural beliefs that impact on our students, because they're learning a new way of negotiating in a new environment. It's very important that we get our students to take risks in the language. If I leave you with one thought, it's encouraging our ESL students or our bilingual, bicultural students to take those risks, to challenge what they hear, to ask for clarification. I think it's important that they also feel that what they have to contribute is very important. The bottom line is creating an effective learning environment so that they can take responsibility.
So following up on that, what is meant by the social psychological influences on learning English?
There are variables that we all as human beings feel threatened by. If our self-confidence and our self-esteem is low, we're not going to perform. We won't negotiate. We will not communicate. And that is what I mean by social psychological, that there's a self-confidence element in learning a language, ESL. You are asking students from another country, from another culture, to risk performance in another language. And every time they say something, every time they produce a piece of work, it really is demonstrating that this is my ability. So the social psychological impact that I'm referring to is the self-confidence level. And it speaks to the issue of creating a very affective learning environment. That's specifically what I mean.
There's something that you said before, and I think it may be related to what I've observed around campus.
Mm-hmm.
The Asian students, particularly the freshmen and sophomores, you will see them take a class, go out, and sit in a group and study. Mm-hmm. Okay, and I mean, they do this quite often. Is that culturally determined? What is going on with that?
Well, I think, and I can certainly speak from personal experience. I love, I love reading. I love studying. I'm a great pursuer of knowledge. I guess it's cultural. I could certainly trace these feelings back to my parents, who were themselves seekers of knowledge. Yes, I believe it's cultural, but I also believe that there's a psychological piece there that there's a familiarity and a mores that they feel comfortable in operating within. Working in groups as opposed to individualization is a way of the Chinese culture too. It's a very group effort, a community effort. So that's why that's very natural to them. I don't know how this translates though to classroom work where students are asked to work in small groups, that is learning language. My area of interest in acculturation is really language development, and Tom's is behavioral.
We're talking about the group aspect, that getting back to European American value system and behavioral code in the schools, and that's difficult for those of us from that group initially to understand. We think that we've opened it to everybody and everybody learns in a certain way, but the way the school is structured pretty much across the United States is that you do your own work. The teacher presents at you, you're expected to listen, then you do your independent work. And European American families in general tend to raise their kids to be independent, and if others can't keep up with you, you leave them in your dust. Other groups tend to promote more of a group orientation. There is the sharing, there is you do things in a community that, I say, Mom, Mike's playing with my bike, and it was my item. In other groups, no, it's not your bike, it's the family's bike. There's the emphasis on the group, that you share, that you work together. And they found that using cooperative learning groups in school, all cultural groups perform better than they do doing independent work, and European American kids do just as well. But we see again, when you let kids work in a way that they understand, share with others. If I've got an idea and you've got an idea, let's put those ideas together, and we've got more ideas, as opposed to, well, I do my work and you do your work. We see even in the workplace now, developing the Japanese model of management, that no longer am I in charge of this division and I do the work, but there are teams that work together, and we're starting to adopt another model in schools and in the workplace.
Well, I want to add on to that, the European American view is certainly, when you talk about cooperative learning, I think that the notion of individuals working together to produce a product is certainly something that's, I think, a great idea because of team effort. But getting back to your idea, what I've observed, interestingly enough, Jorge, is that while the Chinese culture may espouse a group community type learning, when you change the dynamics and have them come to an American setting, I cannot say that they function that well as a group. I cannot say that because I've seen students of Asian background, different Asian groups, who still, let's say in a group of six, let's say six, there are two Asians. They may sit together. They may not. But they'll converse, they'll tend to want to stay together. Now I'm talking about students who are in the earliest stages of language development, English language development. They may stay by themselves and not necessarily negotiate to complete this project or this assignment. So it's interesting that the dynamics change, although there's a philosophy of community, when they get into a European American setting, where we impose certain rules and ideas on them, which they may not have been used to before, because it was never coined cooperative learning or community effort. But now we do that, and we give them roles, so they begin to change. So what's interesting is there's this struggle, and I call it cultural tension, between the old and the new cultures, that is.
Right, having your feet planted in the old, but having your head turned by the new.
Yeah.
And they say that many recent immigrants go through a state of controlled schizophrenia, where you have to act one way in a certain environment, but then you get to the workplace or the school, you have to act a different way. And it's a very difficult thing to do. And I think Virginia's research showed that if you have strong ties to your traditional community, you're more likely to strike out on your own and test out the new ways and to try to learn English. And so the importance of connecting with your group And then that gives you the confidence to go out and try to fit in and try these new ways, but it's nice to have the security to come back to.
Well, exactly, Tom, and I think that when I talked about this continuum of acculturation, there's the perseverance to assimilation, but there's a middle ground, which my research, I coined, well, not alone, John Schumann, of course, calls social adaptation, which is the median, which is the middle ground where students take on or adapt the values and lifestyle of the American culture, but still retain their own for intergroup use. What's interesting is this snapshot of students that I looked at in this research project. Three things were very clear. They were socially committed to the notion of reaching out to the American society. But they clearly had a Chinese preference, which spoke to ethnic loyalty and language loyalty. And the third idea is that they is what I call social exploration, that they were willing to go out and explore, as Tom said, that is willing to date others, which previously the previous immigrant group, the other Chinese, may not have reached out. There has been some research done by an anthropologist, Betty Lee Sung, my mentor, who talks about intermarriage as one of the stages of assimilation. And so you find a lot of theories on acculturation coming together. Each time you look at a new sample, nuances of those acculturation theories are proven, and a new model of acculturation is born. So it's an interesting phenomenon, acculturation.
By the way, what I find interesting with regard to the ESL students in the SEEK program is that they constitute the most successful group.
Yes.
They are graduating at about a 30% rate, while the other students who are born here in the United States are about 18 to 20%. And I keep going back to that group study situation. I really think that has a lot to do with it.
It does, Jorge, and Tom also alluded to this in terms of cooperative learning groups and how fruitful that kind of activity can be. There's also, again, I can talk from myself and from observations, personal observations, that Asian students seem to be pretty determined once they're focused. They're very focused on achieving a goal. Sometimes that's good and sometimes it's not, because all the creativity can be knocked out of the process.
Their traditional style can be misunderstood in our classes. I'm thinking about the many Asian students that have been in our classes and where they were raised back in China, Japan, Korea, wherever. One sits quietly and listens to somebody with the knowledge presented to you. And I run a class where there's a lot of role play and interaction, and it's difficult for them. They do get themselves involved, but it's new for them. Even the style of writing papers that in the American schools, we teach a kid to outline it. 1, A, B, C, D, 2, A, B, C. The Asian style of writing is more circular and a different sort of logic to prove one's point. And a professor not understanding that style can say, there's not enough fact here. You didn't build your case in a sequential way when they wrote the paper the way that makes sense back in their homeland.
I do want to add one more thing about language that I think is really important. If I leave another thought with you, it's the importance of it all hinges on culture. Understanding, students who come from other countries need to understand the pragmatic use of language. What's implied and what's not implied in a given message. Because miscommunication can arise when a student, in a conversation, let's say with a group of students in the cafeteria, or perhaps if they're at a social gathering at a party, if they don't understand the real intended message, I don't mean the literal sense of the word, but the implication of what's behind the words, they're not going to be successful communicators, and they'll miss a lot also. So I think that pragmatics and how you use language and sociolinguistics, the dialects that are appropriate in speaking with students and speaking with professors and speaking with medical folks, there's a different kind of dialect that's necessary for each one. I'm constantly amazed, and I want to cry because our students try so hard to be successful. And our teachers, too, our educators are just terrific out there. I'm a teacher person.
Yeah, I think we need to make our schools, whether it's the public schools or private schools or whether it's higher education, make them more welcoming, more friendly to people with different languages, different learning styles, different behavioral codes, while still saying there are standards. There are universal standards that we can find in all groups. What are those universal standards? What needs to be required in the setting, but how can our setting also be more adaptable, be more flexible to welcome all styles and help us with our own learning, we educators?
I have this theory that if you were to measure the number of students that have been mislabeled for special education, according to three groups, Hispanics, African Americans, and let's say Asians, that you would probably find a disproportionate amount of mislabeling with the first two groups. Do you tend to agree with that?
We find an overrepresentation of African Americans in classrooms for kids with behavior disorders and emotional problems, especially African American boys. We find Hispanics are not overrepresented in that group, but are overrepresented in classrooms for the mentally retarded, the mildly mentally retarded. And a lot of this, again, too, could be a misunderstanding of the learning styles. Kids with limited English proficiency, if they come from a home where English is not widely, regularly used. But we do find certain groups overrepresented in certain categories, and when we see that, we've got to at least be suspicious. You know, why is it that Asian kids, if they're in special ed, are more likely to be learning disabled? African American kids in special ed, emotionally disturbed, behavior disordered, Hispanic kids, mentally retarded. Why are we getting that splitting of groups? Is that accurate, or should we at least be suspicious?
I have a theory, and you'll bear me out because you're the expert on it, and Jorge, you've had more experience than I in special education. It seems that because the Asian students are not verbal, that perhaps they are not seen or viewed as being acting out.
No, they're not troublemakers.
Exactly, because their tendency is to be quiet. That's not to say, and we all know this, just because someone is quiet doesn't mean it's not ticking up here. We all know that it ticks. So I think that may add some dimension to your thinking.
If I'm a general ed teacher, I'm going to say, is that kid interfering with me presenting my lesson? If he is, that's a behavior problem. If he's not picking up from my lessons, then it's LD or MR. But if he sits there and does the work and academically done, that's fine. But we're concerned about under-identification of certain kids too. Kids who come from war-torn countries are going to have some vast emotional turmoil, and they need some help. The kids who are in this, what they call the 1.5 generation, the kids who have the traditional parents, but they are fascinated by the mainstream American culture, and they're pulled, and you have to adapt to different situations, but there are certain situations where you're going to have to make a choice, and somebody's going to be disappointed, and it's hard on those kids, and they may need that emotional guidance, a guidance counselor, some sort of counseling of some sort.
Tom, Virginia, I want to thank you both for being here. We have run out of time and we've barely scratched the surface of the topic. I certainly invite both of you to return and inform us some more. Thank you for being with us. Thank you in the audience, and we hope you'll tune in again next week. Bye now.